In his message commemorating the 18th July celebration of South Africa's first black head of state, UN Secretary General António Guterres said, each year on this day, Nelson Mandela's birthday, we pay tribute to this extraordinary man who embodied the highest aspirations of the United Nations and the human family. But to get a better sense of what former President Nelson Mandela symbolized for the world, we are now joined by the Faculty of Theology Dean at the Stellenbosch University, Professor Reggie Nel. Professor, very good evening to you. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to the Globe.
Good evening, Simpiwe, and thank you for this conversation.
In greater detail, what did Nelson Mandela, symbolize for South Africa, the continent, and the whole world?
I think it's important that, Simpiwe, as you can understand, that we start by acknowledging now the context where we find ourselves in the South African situation, the lives lost, and we want to also commiserate, and we also want to express our condolences to people, also people that have lost livelihoods. And in a sense, this gives us the context within which we have to appreciate the legacy as well as the heritage, the political heritage of former President Nelson Mandela. In the South African context, of course, we must remember that President Mandela continues to inspire processes of reconciliation, of justice, building social cohesion. But we must also remember that, and it's important that we say it today, that he was more than somebody who inspired acts of charity, how important that also is. He was also a political figure that inspired social movements, that inspired policy change, that inspired the activism against racism, as has been said already. And therefore, we need to, in a sense, Simpiwe, move beyond the idea and the image of Madiba as only somebody who would inspire acts of charity, how important that is. He was somebody that led political change. We, as South Africans, see him as somebody who was what one can call a moral leader. He represents a heritage of moral and virtuous leadership. Mm-hmm. But I think it's also important that we also say that we should warn against exceptionalism. Yeah. And what today in one of the reflections, Prof. Koopman refers to also understanding him as part of the moral elite. Madiba represented a movement. He represented, you can almost say, a people, a collective embodiment of the values of Ubuntu. And that's why we as South Africans understand it. I think that's also what we find as resonance internationally, globally, even up until this day, and we can talk about that more.
Now, Professor, this year's commemoration of Mandela Day comes at a very difficult time for South Africa as the country faces its worst civil strife since the dawn of democracy. And having said that, do you reckon, or do you get a sense that the youth and the poor, the vulnerable and the marginalized are still inspired by Mandela?
A few years ago, 2 years ago, a lot of the young people represented by the student movements argued and they reminded us that we should not hold on to a romanticized idea of Madiba. And when they said that, they reminded us Madiba was somebody who stood for change. He stood for transformation. They said that, they are inspired by the Madiba who would want things to change, real change in terms of people's livelihoods, real change in terms of addressing inequalities, whether it regards inequalities in terms of access to higher education, but also concretely inequalities in terms of the socioeconomic realities of our country. People are desperately poor, they said, and the Madiba that inspires them as a younger generation is a Madiba who advocated and was an activist, a politician for change. Mm-hmm. And I think in that sense, he still inspires new movements, new social movements. One can refer to few years ago, the movements that inspired activism with regard to the HIV/AIDS. And in a sense, in today's context, we can also relate it to the reality of what referred to as vaccine hoarding or even vaccine apartheid, where I think the legacy of Madiba as an advocate for change can still inspire new movements for transformation. And that is what we should hold on to. We should not see the alternative to poverty or inequality merely in the context of welfare. That is important, but we must see it in the context of policy change, in the context of, in the South African context, the reconstruction of our economy, the opening up of possibilities for young people who face unemployment, and also, very importantly, the opening up of the opportunities for young people for education.
Yeah. And speaking of social change, as we've just mentioned, we've seen the ruling party, the ANC, try to galvanize communities to come together, to turn their faces and, their eyes from the social and civil strife that we've seen in the past week and focus on doing good. So is this call alone enough to heal and unite South Africa?
This call is important. I think, like I said right at the beginning, we as a country, we mourn the loss of life. We mourn the loss of livelihoods. And in the context of a pandemic, COVID, let us not forget for a moment that we are still facing the pandemic. So in this particular context, simply where the call is timely, all of us need to put hands on deck and join hands to make a difference in our society, in our communities. Of course, it's very difficult in the context of the lockdown, but still, we have a role to play. However, and this is important, I want to remind all of us that when we look at our political leaders, when we look at the way our economy is structured, when we look at how our educational institutions are being managed, and the role that civil society can play in making a difference, then it is more than just one day of doing acts of charity. We have to affirm the wonderful work that are being done, but we need to go beyond that. And going beyond that means that we must continue in the spirit of Madiba to advocate for a better life for all, in the spirit of Madiba to advocate for equality in terms of opportunities, equality in terms of the support, whether it be for businesses. One of the sad realities now is that many small businesses in townships was hurt, some of them terminally so, by what has happened over the last week or so.
True.
And therefore, there must be support for these small and medium-sized businesses. Businesses in townships that provide jobs, businesses in townships that provide basic services. And therefore, beyond Madiba Day, we must be inspired to advocate for the support also of the recovery of our economy and for the transformation of our economy.
And in addition to the support of the recovery of our economy, the United Nations says Madiba's call, for solidarity and an end to racism are particularly relevant today, isn't it? And as social cohesion around the world is under threat, what can the world do from Mandela's fight to fight these social ills?
Absolutely. Simpiwe, if we look a week or so ago after the Euro final and the outrage on the racism that our young soccer players experienced, it reminded us that the battle to overcome racism is not yet over.
Yeah.
If we ask what is the kind of lessons we can learn, Madiba and the legacy of Madiba is a legacy where he reached out to his enemies. Madiba's philosophy was that if I, as a person, a black person in the context of South Africa, if I'm not healed of bitterness, I won't be able even to make a contribution to heal even the oppressors. And therefore, he found that healing, he found that within himself to be able to reach out also to the enemies, to those who we might consider to be even his political enemies. And so we must find the capacity, we must build the capacity that we reach out also to those, maybe our enemies, those who are considered the ostracized in societies. We must, as in the South African context now, as a nation, take hands with each other, overcome our great challenges. But also, as a global community, we must find, ways to work together, north and south, east and west. The rich countries, the poor countries, find a way to take the hand so that we can overcome the challenges that we face. And currently, I would dare say that one of the biggest challenges is how do we ensure that the rollout of vaccines is equitable? How do we ensure that, in our countries, in particular our African continent, that the rollout is accelerated? In the South African context, I would dare say that it is accelerated even over weekends so that we as nations can start with the rebuilding of our livelihoods.
Now, Professor Nel, I want us to focus a bit more on the global perspective of International Mandela Day. We've seen earlier on the UN Secretary General António Guterres pay a moving tribute to Nelson Mandela, and what a great man that he was, who embodied the values that the United Nations always advocated for. In 2015, you'll recall that the General Assembly extended the scope of Nelson Mandela Day to promote humane conditions of imprisonment, and this appears to be the forgotten group, Prof. I mean, why is it important to include them in events marking Mandela Day?
Mandela is always, or sometimes also mentioned, the world's most famous prisoner. And in saying that, he advocated for the dignity also of prisoners. And it's important. When we look at the Nelson Mandela reformation of the prison system, the particular Nelson Mandela rule, it advocates for the dignity of prisoners as well. When I worked in the 90s, as a religious worker in the prisons, I discovered that many of the prisoners are there because of circumstances. Many are there even, because of situations beyond their control. But yes, we need to support our criminal justice system. But the reality is that if our criminal justice system, based on the Mandela principles, are not transformed to be spaces of rehabilitation, spaces of the reintegration of prisoners in our communities, to be able to make their contributions to our society, then we might be missing many Nelson Mandelas that can come and make a difference in society. Of course, we support the criminal justice system, but we must advocate for the transformation of our criminal justice system so that the dignity of people is upheld.
All right, Professor Reggie Nel, great chatting to you. Thank you so much for your thoughts and for your analysis of this matter.
Thank you.
Well, that was the Faculty of Theology Dean at the Stellenbosch University, Professor Reggie Nel, speaking to us live via Zoom and sharing his thoughts and reflections on Mandela Day.